Hello everybody, it's Diamond Studios, and I'm back for yet another episode of the Mario Marathon. In case you haven't been watching this series of videos, I'm on a quest to review all the main Mario platformers, starting in 1985 with the original game, all the way to the modern day. In the last few episodes of this marathon, I covered all the classic 2D Mario games and explained what makes them the instant icons that they are. Even if it wasn't always pretty, I liked most of these games, and it was a lot of fun revisiting them again. Now that they're all done with, the next natural step would be the Italian plumber's transition to 3D, but there's still a few more games left to cover before moving on to that. The first I want to tackle is Super Mario All-Stars, a collection of all 4 NES Mario games remastered for the Super Nintendo. Since I'm covering a collection of games I've already reviewed, this will be a fairly short one. I'll be going over all the games included and examining how these remastered versions compare to the originals. Additionally, I won't be talking about the stories for any of the games since they're identical to the originals. Alright, let's get started with this. Despite the fact that this is just a collection of existing games, there is some development background to briefly go over, so as usual, feel free to skip to this timestamp to get right into the review. Super Mario All-Stars was once again handled by Nintendo Entertainment Analysis and Development, the same team responsible for the development of the past Mario games. The idea for the compilation supposedly emerged sometime after the release of Super Mario Kart. Development of Yoshi's Island was underway, so Nintendo had a gap in its release schedule between Mario Kart and that game. This gap was certainly not a good thing, considering that Nintendo was in the middle of an intense console war with Sega and their console, the Genesis. To fill the empty space, Shigeru Miyamoto suggested the idea of a sort of value pack of all the previous Mario games for the Super Nintendo. His idea was to give international players a chance to experience Lost Levels, the game that had been deemed too difficult for said players back in the late 80s, when a modified version of Doki Doki Panic that included Mario characters was released instead. The compilation was initially planned to be called Mario Extravaganza, which I'm glad was changed because it sounds kinda generic. Regardless, the developer's main task was updating the graphics for the new hardware. Nintendo chose to fully remaster the games instead of leaving them unmodified, like how that shitty lazy Ninja Gaiden SNES collection was. The graphic designers based the new visuals on Super Mario World, and gave the characters thick black outlines to stick out alongside the more detailed backgrounds. Besides that, they chose not to alter any animations for the sake of preserving the feel of the originals. All these alterations were done by hand, and assistant director Tadashi Sugiyama even ran the originals as he worked in the remakes as a point of comparison. The team also added a save feature with a battery backup system in the cartridge as a means of making the games, particularly Lost Levels, easier for beginners. In fact, designer Naoki Mori actually refused to debug Lost Levels because of how difficult it was. That's hilarious to me. The game was so shitty that one of Nintendo's own designers refused to play it and look for glitches. Like, yeah, we knew it was trash. Anyways, the collection was released in 1993 and received critical acclaim. It was also the first time Westerners were able to play Lost Levels, and it quickly became infamous for, well, obvious reasons. Many critics and publications stated that the games had aged well and that the collection was an excellent purchase for anyone who owned an SNES but had missed out on the previous games, or those who had sold their NES and could no longer play the old games. The collection would later see a repackaging of Super Mario All-Stars plus World, which obviously included Super Mario World alongside the other games, and a re-release on the Wii for Mario's 25th anniversary. These days, All-Stars is considered a great package and one of the best games on the SNES library, but some people will still say the way to go is the NES versions. That's pretty much all there is to go over, so let's get started with the review itself. Let's begin in the most appropriate place, Super Mario Bros. Super Mario Bros. Was originally released on the NES in 1985, and was obviously the first mainline game in the Mario franchise. If you remember back to my review, I liked this game quite a bit, even with the fair few issues it had. So let's see whether or not the SNES remaster does anything to improve the game for the new hardware. Let's start with the graphics. This version of the game is the best looking one by far. The NES version's visuals are unappealing with a small amount of colors, of course limited to brown, green, and white, and occasional splashes of blue and red. This version, on the other hand, still looks great to this day. There's a much wider palette of colors and much greater detail to the environments, which is expected with the new hardware. The backgrounds are also much better. Instead of simply being a flat color, they're actual backgrounds that have a decent amount of detail to them. Overall, the visuals of the All-Stars version of Super Mario Bros. Are a massive step up from the NES version. And next, the soundtrack. Just like the graphics, this rendition of the soundtrack is much better than the others. As great as the NES version's soundtrack was, the All-Stars version is a clear step up for me. The melodies have obviously been preserved since they're the same songs, but the instrumentation of the remake makes the songs much more catchy. In fact, this game's version of the original overworld theme may just be my favorite rendition of the song. This game also adds a new theme to the underground bonus areas rather than just recycling the underground theme, and has a new track for the Bowser fights. I still prefer the NES rendition of the castle theme, but besides that, this version of the game's OST is a major step up from the original. Now on to gameplay. This version is just as solid as the original, and in fact, I think it's somewhat improved. The level design is obviously the exact same as the NES version, so my critique that it's a bit too basic still applies, but it's still solid in spite of this, so I'm not bothered. What else can you expect from a remake, right? What has seen some major improvements, however, has to be the controls. I thought the NES version's control was functional, but had some aspects that made Mario feel stiff in comparison to later games. In this remaster, however, Mario's movement and acceleration have been seemingly tweaked in a way that makes the control feel a lot smoother. It's very hard to explain, and it could just be the SNES controller's better D-pad, but if you were to play the two versions back to back as I did, the difference would be very noticeable. As a result, Mario is a lot more enjoyable to control in this version, which allows me to enjoy it even more here. The game's difficulty balancing has also seen some improvement. Whereas the original game had limited continues, if you don't know about the continue code, the SNES version adds a fully fledged save feature. It also starts you with 5 lives instead of just 3, which is an improvement I didn't even know I wanted. The hit point system I criticized in my original review unfortunately still hasn't been changed to the Mario 3 system, but the improvements this version does make are appreciated. My biggest criticism of this remake then has to be the brick physics. If you don't know what I'm talking about, think back to the original. When you hit a brick block as Big Mario, you would smash it and a bit of downwards momentum would be applied to the character. In this version, however, hitting brick blocks makes you hang in the air for a split second rather than immediately falling back to the ground, which does make this game a little bit slower paced than the original. I can see why many might prefer the NES version because of this issue, but to be honest, it doesn't bother me all that much. It's still something the NES version does better, mind you, but it's unintrusive enough not to get on my nerves. Overall, this is my preferred version of this game. Not only are the graphics and music much better than those of the original, but the controls feel a lot smoother and the remake adds a save feature and starts you with more lives. Yes, it doesn't fix the flawed power-up hit system and the brick physics are a slight bit slower than the original, but neither of these things prevent me from considering this the definitive version of Mario 1. If you want to play the game, definitely go for this version. With that, let's move on to the two games to come out of the awkward period between 1986 to 1988, Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels and Super Mario Bros. 2. In case you need a refresher, these are 2 of the 3 games from the series I dislike, alongside a much later entry we won't get to for a while. Needless to say, these versions are pretty much the same way. However, the 2 games still do feature a few improvements on SNES. First, let's talk about... Yeah, let's get this over with. I'm going to talk about Lost Levels first. The Famicom Disk System version was already the worst game in the Mario series, and this version... yeah, it's really not that much better. Now, to be fair, the graphics and music are once again improved. The music is the exact same as the SMB1 remaster since Lost Levels was so lazy that it recycled the music from the original to begin with, but since this compilation is my preferred version of the soundtrack, I'm a little bit more forgiving this time around. The graphics are also light years ahead of the original. That version was easily the ugliest Mario game ever made, but the SNES port actually doesn't look too shabby, with its far more colorful and detailed visuals and much better backgrounds. I still prefer the look of the Mario 1 remaster, but this one looks fine as well. The gameplay also has some improvements. The better control of the Mario 1 remaster also carries over here, minus the awkward upwards momentum you get from stomping on enemies that the original had. This version also adds a much needed save per level system, meaning it's a far more accessible version of the game right out of the gate. However, these improvements really don't mean that much because it's Lost Levels we're talking about here. It's akin to polishing a turd. Yeah, you can clean it up and improve it all you want, but it's still a big piece of shit at the end of the day. The level design is brought over beat for beat, which is not a good thing considering how awful it was to begin with. Terrible enemy placement, atrocious platforming that contradicts the control scheme, infuriating set piece, it's got it all. I still couldn't be asked to get past the second world because Lost Levels is just that bad of a game. Yes, this version is a lot better than the original, but it still sucks a fat one. With that, let's discuss Super Mario Bros. 2, baby! Okay, I had to do that, I'm really sorry. This version pretty much breaks even with the original for me, containing some improvements alongside an equal number of steps backward, and as a result, I don't care for this version either. The graphics have once again seen an upgrade. They're more colorful, detailed, blah blah blah, you get the picture. The soundtrack, on the other hand, is a lot worse than the original. The instrumentation of this version is just not as good in my opinion, and it leads to several songs, particularly the cave theme, sounding rather shitty. I mean, take a listen to this. The gameplay is the exact same as the original, including all the pros and cons that version had. I still like the level design and character switching mechanic, though it is weird how the selection screen is in the wrong aspect ratio for some reason. This version also adds a save feature and does away with the limited continues, which I appreciate quite a bit, but it's still in service of clunky controls and poor enemy placement. I swear, the controls might even be slightly more slippery in this version. Maybe it's just me, but it can make certain sections even more of a pain in the ass to play than the NES original. So yeah, this version is just as much of a mixed bag as the NES one, and I don't don't really enjoy playing it all that much. Yes, I know many people do like it, and trust me, I have no problem with that. If you love this game, I have no intention to take that away from you. However, what else am I supposed to say about a game that brings me nothing but boredom and annoyance when I play it? Again, feel free to like Mario 2, just know that I don't. Finally, we've reached the last game on the compilation, Super Mario Bros. 3. This game was by far my favorite of the 4 NES titles, so how does this remaster fare in comparison? Quite well, I'd say. In fact, I would argue that Mario 3 alone makes this collection a good deal. In my review of the game, I said that Mario 3 had the best visuals out of all the NES Mario games, and I stand by that assessment. However, while that version looked good in its own right, this version is quite an improvement. The sprites and environments are a lot more colorful, the backgrounds look fantastic, the works. It's simply gorgeous and a true pleasure to look at. Also, remember how I said Super Mario World was my favorite looking 2D Mario game in the last review? Well, I really think I jumped the gun. I think this version of Mario 3 is my favorite looking 2D Mario entry. Don't get me wrong, Super Mario World looks great, but this game has a much more detailed art style and an even wider color palette, which makes me prefer its visuals overall. Next, the remix soundtrack. This rendition of the OST is middle of the road for the 3 versions. I like the NES version's OST the most, while the GBA version is the weakest of the 3. This one sounds like a higher quality version of the GBA renditions, but it's still not as catchy or lively as the NES version. Sounds pretty good, just not the best. I think it comes down to the instrumentation, which lacks a bit of energy when compared to the chiptune version. I do prefer this version's remixes of the underwater music and the theme for the World 3 map, though. Take a listen to those. Oh boy, that's good. But other than that, I prefer the NES renditions. As for the gameplay, it's probably the most faithful out of all the remakes. The controls feel identical, which is a good thing considering how satisfying and precise the controls of the NES version are. The level design is also the exact same, which is, again, good. Mario 3 is fun as hell on the NES and is just as enjoyable to play here. However, one addition that this version does make is the save feature. The lack of saving in the original didn't really bother me, but it is nice to have this regardless. Unfortunately, you will have to restart the world you saved on if you quit the game and reload it later, but it's still a little better than having to restart the whole game like on NES. In case you can't tell, this is my favorite of the 4 games included in the original standalone cartridge. It's a very faithful port of the game and maintains everything that made the original so much fun to play. It even makes some improvements like the updated graphics and the addition of a save feature. As such, this may just be the definitive version of the game. But to be entirely honest, I think I slightly prefer the NES version. It's incredibly subjective, and the 2 versions are so similar that I can play either and enjoy myself just as much as if I were playing the other. It really only comes down to the more catchy music of the original version, to be honest. So I'd say the SNES version is objectively the best one, and it's the one of the 2 I'd recommend to newcomers, but the NES version is still perfectly fine. However, we're not quite done yet. As I said in the intro, an updated version of Super Mario All-Stars was released in 1994. This version had one major difference. It not only had the remasters of the first 4 Mario games, but it also included Super Mario World. Let's take a quick look at that. In short, if I had to choose one version of this game to get, it would definitely be this one. Not only does it include the 4 remakes I've already talked about, which is already worth it, but it also has what I consider to be my favorite 2D Mario entry, Super Mario World. If that isn't a hell of a bargain, then I don't know what is. This is the definitive version of Mario World for me. It's obviously the Super Nintendo version of the game, almost identical to the standalone version. However, this variant includes an extra save file to fit in with the other games. In addition, it features the best Luigi sprite in the whole 2D series. Luigi was just a green Mario in the standalone version, but he actually looks like himself in this one. Sadly, you can only play as him in the lackluster 2-player mode, but it's still a pretty cool addition. The All-Stars version also allows you to exit the game by pressing select on the map screen, so you don't have to hit reset if you want to play a different game on the cartridge. You'll lose any unsaved progress if you do this, however, so be sure to save before quitting. So needless to say, this variant of the game is even better than the already masterful original, and only serves to further increase the value of Super Mario All-Stars as a package. In the end, I don't know what more I can say about Super Mario All-Stars. It's definitely one of the finest releases the Mario series has ever seen. The remasters of the game are very well done, including updated visuals, improved music and controls in some of the games, and save features that the NES versions didn't have. In addition, there's also another variant that includes Super Mario World, which is a deal and a half. Hey, it's the title! If you've never played these games for whatever godforsaken reason, then you can't go wrong with picking up Super Mario All-Stars. I would recommend getting the version that includes Super Mario World since it's insanely convenient convenient to own all the games on the same cartridge. You can either get it on SNES or on an emulator, since Nintendo doesn't seem to want to re-release this variant for whatever reason. Regardless, that's all I have to say about Super Mario All-Stars. I only have a few more games to cover to round off this portion of the marathon, and then we'll finally be able to cover the series jump into the third dimension. So join me next time when I cover the two Super Mario Land games. Both were released for the original Game Boy in 1989 and 1992. Yeah, I know, this marathon isn't in release order, but this is how I wanted to do things. In any event, this has been Diamond Miner Studios, and I'll see you in the next review. Have a good day.
Have a good fucking day.